researchers around the world are beginning to find clues to ways in which it might be treated. The problem is with tinnitus is that it's a symptom. It's a bit like pain or itching. It's not necessarily a description of what is a specific disorder. And our auditory system doesn't just start at our ears, it tracks up through the auditory pathway to our brains. And the problem with tinnitus is that for some people it might be something wrong with their ear, but it might be something going wrong higher up the auditory pathway, and that makes it quite difficult to diagnose, and it means that different people might need different kinds of treatment. We're interested in how the sensory cells in the ear work. They're very delicate, they respond to really minute movements induced by sound. They're very, very delicate, and if damage happens to them, we know this from various drug research studies in people who've been given very strong antibiotic. If damage occurs to them, people report tinnitus. So it's like the brain is no longer getting normal signal from the ear, and then that gives you a sensation. The brain is trying to detect a signal which isn't coming in normally, and people report tinnitus. But we've also been working on something called a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical that nerve cells use to send one signal to another nerve cell, and the auditory system is based on a neurotransmitter called glutamate, and we know that over-release of that particular neurotransmitter, or lack of mopping up of that neurotransmitter, can cause tinnitus. And there are drugs that are actually used in epilepsy research and indeed in clinical practice that might be of value to some people. But that's very early, because these drugs are very strong and you have to be careful who you give them to. I think it's hard to get a coherent population of people who have got the same cause of tinnitus in a particular trial. I don't think there are a lack of volunteers. I get a lot of letters from people saying they would like to be involved. But the real problem is a consistent diagnosis would be useful for tinnitus, and understanding at which level it comes from. Yes, there is actually. The problem is that, you know, we're all, as a population, we're all living longer, and auditory disorders are becoming more common in the sense that we're all living longer. And it's much harder to get funding for auditory research than it is for cardiovascular research or for AIDS, which, I mean, it's very unfortunate for the people who've got it, but it affects a fewer number of people in the population. By the time you're 90, all of us will have significant hearing problems. I think the problem is with hearing disorders in general, not just tinnitus, is that they're less obvious. You know, if you've got a broken arm or broken leg, if you're dying of a disease, then it's much more obvious. And the problem with these hearing disorders, including tinnitus, is they're not so apparent necessarily to your friends and colleagues. The thing about tinnitus is that suffering from it can make people very, very unhappy and very depressed. And the drugs that you've mentioned are not going to treat the tinnitus, but they are likely to help in certain cases. These drugs are given under close monitoring, I understand. I'm not a medic, but they're given under close monitoring by the GP, and they would give them for a short period of time and see the person back again within a few weeks to check whether they'd been helpful or not. But they don't treat tinnitus. I haven't heard, but I'm not medically qualified to comment, that they make it worse, but they might make it more bearable. Well, loud noise when you're young, especially if it leaves you feeling that you've got cotton wool in your ears after you've been to the rock concert or whatever, damages the sensory cells in the inner ear. Now, you might not notice that when you're in your 20s, but because as we get older, the sensory cells die, some of them die, then it can be a very delayed effect. Other causes of tinnitus can be quite serious, but they're not usually so. So if you have something called a vestibular schwannoma, okay, which is kind of tumour pressing on your nerve, of your auditory nerve, or if you have Meniere's disease, which is a disease of the ionic balance in the ear, then you can get tinnitus. And ENT surgeons always check that out if you report for tinnitus. But in fact, very few people actually have a diagnostic cause of tinnitus. Information can be obtained from major auditory charities in this area, okay, and that might be helpful, might be reassuring, might point people in the right direction. If people want to help somebody who's got tinnitus or want to help themselves, they of course could help those charities to raise funds in those areas and be specific about what the reasons are, because the major charities who are involved in supporting research in this area also support other aspects of research into hearing disorders. The first thing, if you develop tinnitus, is it's important not to panic. People can live with noises. I've lived with RAF stations with tornadoes and javelins taking off at the end of the runway. I've lived with train stations. They didn't frighten me because I knew what they were. And that helps enormously. Not to be frightened is important. That's not to say, and I'm not trivialising tinnitus, it's important to go and get help. And if your particular GP is unsympathetic, then ask to see somebody else, because more and more of the UK's population of medics is understanding that this can be a very distressing condition, and they will help.